The night Inez Barrett saddled the last horse in Caldwell's livery stable, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely buckle the cinch strap, and she told herself it was the cold November air of 1882 and not the terror living inside her chest like a caged animal. The town of Harlow's Creek, Kansas sat quiet as a graveyard at that hour, just past 2 in the morning, the saloon lights finally extinguished, and the cattle drovers long since passed out in their rented rooms above the Silver Spur. Inez had waited for this silence the way a person waits for rain in a drought desperately, counting every minute, watching the clock on the mantel of the house she shared with her brother-in-law with something close to religious devotion. She had packed light because she understood running. You do not carry heavy things when your life depends on moving fast. A canvas satchel with a change of clothes, the $43 she had been hiding in the lining of her winter coat for 7 months, a small tintype photograph of her mother, and the deed to a parcel of land in Colorado that her late husband Clement had left to her before he died. Before he was killed, she corrected herself, though she still could not say that out loud without her throat closing up. The horse was a roan mare, sturdy and calm-eyed, and Inez had chosen her specifically because she was the last one left in the stable. The other 4 horses belonged to men who would be checking on them by morning. The roan belonged to the stable owner, old Caldwell himself, who had ridden into Wichita 2 days ago on family business and would not return until Friday. It was Wednesday. Inez had done the arithmetic more times than she could count. She had 2 days before anyone noticed the mare was gone, and by then she would be deep enough into the territory that finding her would take more effort than she was worth. Or so she prayed. She led the mare toward the stable gate, stepping carefully over the loose board near the 3rd stall that creaked like a dying man whenever any weight fell on it. She held the lantern low, the flame turned down to almost nothing, just enough amber light to see the shapes of things without broadcasting her presence to the whole street. The mare followed her without complaint, and Inez whispered soft nonsense words to her, the kind of soothing sounds that came naturally and meant nothing except "I am here, we are together, do not be afraid." She reached the gate. A man was leaning against it. Inez stopped so suddenly that the mare bumped into her from behind, and she nearly dropped the lantern. The man straightened from his slouch against the gatepost with a slow, unhurried movement that told her he had been there for a while, that he had seen her coming, that he had made the deliberate choice to wait rather than announce himself. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she had initially registered in the dim light, wearing a working man's canvas coat over a flannel shirt, his hat pushed back slightly on his head in a way that allowed her to see his face. He was perhaps 30. Maybe a year or 2 either side of it, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that caught the lantern light and held it in a way that made it impossible to read his expression. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. He did not shout. He simply looked at her with a steadiness that was somehow more unnerving than aggression would have been. "Tell me what you're running from," he said. His voice was low and even, calibrated for the hour, not unkind. It was not a demand exactly, though it held a certain weight that made clear he was not asking idly. Inez tightened her grip on the lantern and on the mare's lead rope. Her mind was calculating at a furious pace. Could she push past him? Could she mount quickly enough? Could she outride him if she had a head start? She had not survived the last 3 years by being naive about the intentions of men who appeared in dark doorways and spoke to her in quiet voices. "Move away from the gate," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. "Not yet," he said simply, not aggressively, just firmly. "You have no right to stop me." "You're right," he agreed, and that surprised her. "I don't have any legal right to stop you. But I watched you slip out of the Barrett house 40 minutes ago with that bag over your shoulder, and I've been standing here trying to decide whether I should mind my own business or whether there's something happening that I ought to know about." The Barrett house. So he knew who she was, or knew Clement's name, which came to the same thing in this town. "My name is not Barrett anymore," she said, and the words came out with more bitterness than she intended. Something shifted in the man's expression, a small adjustment around the eyes, a kind of recalibration. "What is it then?" she hesitated. There was something in the asking of it that felt genuine, like he actually wanted to know rather than asking to fill the silence or to get leverage. "Inez," she finally said, just her given name, no last name offered. "Warren Bancroft," he said by way of response. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a reflex of politeness, she realized, more than any formal introduction. "I'm the new deputy here. I took the position about 6 weeks ago. A deputy." The information landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into cold water. A lawman. Of all the people to be standing at this gate. "Then you should understand that I am a free woman and I am choosing to leave this town," she said carefully. "There is nothing unlawful about that." "Nothing unlawful," he confirmed. "But the horse, I will see that Mr. Caldwell is compensated," she said quickly. "I know where he stables his horses in Wichita. I will ride as far as the railhead at Newton, leave the mare with someone reliable, and send word to Caldwell where she can be collected. I am borrowing her, not stealing her." Warren Bancroft studied her for a long moment. The wind moved through the open eave of the stable roof and stirred the hay and made the lantern flame lean sideways and then right itself. Somewhere down the main street, a dog barked twice and was quiet. "That is a reasonable arrangement," he said slowly. "But it doesn't answer my question. I did not agree to answer your question." "No," he said, "you didn't." Another silence stretched between them. Inez became aware that her heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear of pursuit, and everything to do with the peculiar quality of this man's attention. He looked at her the way you look at something you are trying to understand rather than something you are trying to control, and she was not accustomed to that distinction. "Harlow's Creek is not safe for me," she said at last, because she could not stand the weight of the silence, and because something about his stillness made her want to fill it. "Not anymore, maybe it never was." "Is it Rourke?" he asked. The name hit her like a cold cloth to the face. Patrick Rourke. Her late husband's business partner, and the man who had maneuvered to take everything Clement had worked for within 6 weeks of Clement's death, which had not been from natural causes regardless of what the official account said. The man who had made it quietly, unmistakably clear to Inez that her future in Harlow's Creek depended on her cooperation, and her cooperation meant signing over the land deed in Colorado that was the last thing of value she possessed. "How do you know that name?" she asked. Warren pushed himself off the gatepost and took a step toward her. She held her ground even though every instinct told her to step back. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak at barely above a murmur, far enough that she did not feel crowded. "Because I have been watching Patrick Rourke for 6 weeks," he said. "Since before I took the deputy position here. There are people in this county who believe he was involved in at least 2 deaths, including that of your husband, and there is an inquiry being assembled in Wichita, a federal one." Inez stared at him. The roan mare shifted her weight behind her and blew a soft breath against the back of her neck. "Clement," she said, "just his name, a small acknowledgement." "Yes," Warren said quietly. "I'm sorry." She had not expected the apology. She had not expected any of this. She had expected to slip out of this town unnoticed and ride north in the dark and put enough distance between herself and Patrick Rourke's reaching hands that she could finally breathe again. She had not expected a man to be leaning on the stable gate asking her to tell him what she was running from, and she had not expected that man to already know the answer and to say the word sorry like he actually meant it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because if you ride out of here tonight alone in the dark, you are going to run into one of Rourke's men before you reach the county line," Warren said. "He has people watching the roads. He knows about the Colorado land, and he knows you're going to run eventually because he's been pushing you toward it. He wants you gone without the deed, or he wants you to panic and go to him before you leave. Either way, you lose." Inez felt the anger rise in her throat, hot and clean. "And what is your solution, Deputy Bancroft?" "Come back inside," he said. "Not to the Barrett house." There is a widow named Mrs. Clara Fenn on Cottonwood Street who keeps a spare room and does not ask questions of women who need a place to stay. I have her complete trust. You can stay there tonight, and tomorrow I can get you out of Harlow's Creek on the stage with a ticket that is paid for, and with company that will see you safely to Newton. And what do you get from this arrangement? She asked, because she had learned that kindness from men always came with a price tag. Warren looked at her for a long moment, and she could see that the question had not offended him, only made him thoughtful in the way of someone who wants to give an honest answer rather than a convenient one. I get a witness, he said at last. A credible one. Someone who was in that house, who knew Clement Barrett, who knows what Rourke has been doing and saying. The federal inquiry needs testimony, and yours would be the most valuable thing they could have. She had expected money, or something physical, or the kind of offer that required her to be grateful in ways she was not willing to be. She had not expected this. The practicality of it startled her, but more than that, the honesty of it. He had not pretended his motives were purely noble. He needed something from her, and he told her plainly what it was. You are asking me to stay in the town I am trying to escape, she said, and testify against one of the most dangerous men in this county, trusting that a brand new deputy with 6 weeks on the job can protect me from the consequences of that. I am asking you to consider it, he said. I am not going to force you. He stepped to the side then, creating a clear path to the gate. If you want to ride out, ride out. But I wanted you to know what I know before you made that decision. She looked at the open gate. The mare shifted eagerly behind her, sensing the freedom in the movement of air from outside. The road north was right there, dark and quiet and calling to her. She stood for a very long time in that stable doorway. Then she handed Warren Bancroft the lantern and led the mare back to her stall. Clara Fenn's house on Cottonwood Street was small and warm and smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke. And Clara herself was a compact woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and an expression that suggested she had seen enough of life's difficult arrangements to be unsurprised by anything. She opened the door at Warren's quiet knock without apparent alarm, looked at Inez with a clear and evaluating gaze, and then stepped aside to let her in. "Third room on the left," Clara said. "There is hot water on the stove if you want it. Breakfast at 7. That was all. No questions, no explanations requested. Inez looked at Warren over her shoulder as Clara guided her down the hall, and he was standing in the doorway still, his hat in his hands now, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite name. Not pity, she would have resented pity. Something softer and more complicated than that. Something that looked, in the amber light of Clara's hallway, almost like concern. She did not sleep well, but she slept, and that was more than she had managed in the 3 nights before. In the morning she found Clara Fenn at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and the particular patient expression of someone who is available to listen but will not press. Inez sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup, and told her enough. Not everything, she was not ready for everything, but enough that Clara nodded with a kind of grim recognition, as if the shape of Inez's story was familiar to her from other women's stories she had heard over the years. "Rourke is a careful man," Clara said. "He does not leave fingerprints, he uses other people's hands." "He used the Barrett family name," Inez said. "Clement's brother Thomas is still here, still under Rourke's thumb, and he thinks I am the problem. He thinks if I would just sign the deed and leave quietly, everything would go back to normal." "What Thomas thinks is worth exactly nothing," Clara said flatly. "That man has never had a useful thought in his life. Clement was the one with sense." Inez looked up. "You knew Clement?" "I knew his mother," Clara said. "She was a good woman. She would have been devastated to see what has happened to everything she worked for." She paused and then said, more gently, "I am sorry for your loss, dear, truly." That was the second time in 12 hours someone had said those words to Inez and meant them, and it unraveled something inside her that had been wound very tight for a very long time. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and managed not to cry, though it was a near thing. Warren came by mid-morning, and Inez met him at Clara's front door with her arms crossed and her jaw set, because she had spent the early morning hours re-examining his offer and cataloging all the ways it could go wrong for her. "Tell me about the federal inquiry," she said by way of greeting. He did not seem surprised by the lack of pleasantries. He took off his hat and held it and spoke to her clearly, the way a person speaks when they are not trying to manage you, but simply to inform you. A federal marshal named Aldridge had been building a case against Patrick Rourke for 18 months, he told her. There were land disputes in 3 counties, a suspicious fire that had killed a cattle rancher named Olson and his foreman last spring, and the matter of Clement Barrett's death, which the county doctor had recorded as a riding accident but which several people had reason to doubt. The inquiry was close to convening. What it needed was someone who had been inside Rourke's sphere of influence and could speak to what they had witnessed directly. "Clement told me things," Inez said slowly. "In the last weeks before he died, he was afraid. He kept records, a ledger with dates and amounts and names. He said it was insurance." Warren went very still. "Do you know where that ledger is?" "I know where he said he kept it," she said. "Whether it is still there is another question." "Where?" She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through Clara's front window and fell across his face, and in the daylight she could see things about him that the darkness had obscured. The steadiness of his gaze. The way he held his hat, turning the brim slowly in both hands as if he needed something to do with his hands. The careful way he spoke, choosing words the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. "The land office," she said. "Clement had a lockbox there, registered in his name. When he died, no one thought to look for it because no one knew it existed. Thomas certainly did not know. Rourke may not know either. If we can retrieve that ledger before anyone else does," Warren said, and his voice had a quality of careful excitement in it, tightly controlled, "it would change everything about the inquiry. How do we retrieve it without Rourke's people seeing?" Warren looked at her for another moment and then said something that she had not expected at all. "Together." The land office in Harlow's Creek occupied a narrow storefront on the main street between the post office and the Assier's office, and it was staffed by a thin, nervous man named Hector Prout who sweated through his collars even in November and who was, Warren told her quietly as they walked toward it, not one of Rourke's men but was afraid of Rourke in the way that small, cautious people tend to be afraid of large, powerful ones. "Leave him to me," Warren said. "I can handle a conversation," Inez replied. "I know you can," he said easily. "But you are supposed to be leaving town today, according to everything Rourke's people believe. We don't want anyone reporting back to him that you were walking into the land office." She conceded the point with a slight tilt of her head. Warren went in first, and Inez waited around the corner, watching the street with her collar turned up against the wind. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind that turned your breath to mist and made the distant prairie look like it stretched all the way to the edge of the known world. She had always found Kansas beautiful in its stark way, the flat land and the enormous sky and the dry grass moving in the wind like water. She had come here at 24 as Clement Barrett's bride with 2 trunks and an optimistic heart, and she was leaving it at 27 with a canvas satchel and no illusions left. Except that was no longer quite true, because something about this particular morning felt different from the grinding dread of the past 7 months. Something felt like it was shifting. She heard her name and turned. Warren was at the doorway, holding it open, and she walked in. Hector Prout was behind his counter, looking anxious in his customary way, his fingers working the edge of a document. He looked at Inez and then at Warren and then at Inez again. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, "or, I beg your pardon." "I wasn't sure if Miss Inez Barrett is the registered widow of Clement Barrett and the authorized heir to any property registered in his name," Warren said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of his badge without being aggressive about it. "She has the legal right to access the lockbox registered to her husband's estate." Prout swallowed. "Yes, of course. I'll need to see the deed of survivorship." Inez produced it from inside her coat. She had carried it with her every day for 7 months, along with the land deed for Colorado, both documents close to her body at all times because she had understood that they were the only real things she owned in the world. Pruitt examined it for longer than was strictly necessary, clearly trying to find a reason to delay or refuse that would allow him to avoid whatever consequence he feared most. But the document was clean and legal and complete, and after a long and uncomfortable minute, he disappeared into the back room and returned with a small metal lockbox. Inez's hands were steady as she accepted it. She did not open it there. She thanked Pruitt politely and walked out with Warren beside her. They went to Clara's house, and Clara set coffee on the table and excused herself to the back garden with a tact that suggested long experience in giving people the privacy they needed. Inez set the lockbox on the table and produced a small key from the lining of her satchel, where it had lived beside the $43 for all this time, and opened it. Clement's handwriting looked up at her from the pages of a small, densely written ledger, and her throat tightened immediately. He had been meticulous. Dates, dollar amounts, property descriptions, names. Payments made to county officials who then approved land transfers that should not have been approved. Recorded evidence of intimidation, including a meeting at which Rourke had explicitly told Clement that his continued good health depended on his continued cooperation. And on the last page, dated 9 days before his death, a note in Clement's cramped, careful hand. If something happens to me, look for Rourke's arrangement with the railroad assessor. The land in Colorado is not what he says it is. Inez read that line twice. Then she looked up at Warren. He knew, she said. He knew Rourke was going to. He knew he was in danger, and he put this here because he wanted someone to find it. He made sure you had the key, Warren said gently. She had not thought of it that way. Clement had pressed that key into her hand 3 weeks before he died, and told her it was for a lockbox at the land office, and that she should never tell anyone about it, and that if anything ever happened to him, she should go straight to the land office and open it and take whatever was inside to someone she trusted. She had been carrying the key for 7 months, thinking of it as Clement's final protection for her, but she had been afraid to go to the land office because doing so would have required her to go openly into Harlow's Creek's public spaces where Rourke's people could see her. Warren had given her a way to do it safely. She had not made that calculation until this moment, and the recognition of it settled over her with a strange warmth. This ledger, Warren said, picking it up carefully, turning the pages with a respectful slowness, combined with your testimony about Rourke's conversations with you directly, this would give Marshal Aldridge what he needs. Then let us get it to Marshal Aldridge, Inez said. It was not simple and it was not quick. Warren spent that afternoon drafting a telegram that he sent from the Wichita office via the stage driver, one of the 3 people in Harlow's Creek he trusted completely. He had been building relationships quietly since his arrival 6 weeks ago, mapping the landscape of who could be relied upon and who could not, which had always been the work of good law work, and which he had been taught by an older marshal in Missouri, who had taught him that you cannot do this job alone, and that the first skill to develop is knowing who your allies are. He told Inez this over supper at Clara's table that evening, and she found herself listening with a quality of attention she had not given to anyone in a long time. He spoke about his work the way people speak about things they actually believe in rather than things they do because they need to eat, with a kind of quiet passion that was not performative. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith, and had worked cattle drives for several years before a series of events that he described with characteristic understatement had led him to understand that what he actually wanted to do with his life was law work. What series of events? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he was going to deflect or generalize the way men often did when they did not want to examine themselves too closely. But he said, I was on a drive out of Texas in '78, and we came through a settlement that was having trouble with a land grabber, very similar situation to what is happening here. A family had been pushed off their property through a set of fraudulent arrangements, and they had nothing left and no one was helping them. I went to the town marshal and he was in the land grabber's pocket. And I thought, someone should do this job properly. Someone should actually be in that office representing the people it is supposed to represent. So you became that person, Inez said. I tried, he said. I am still trying. And then he looked at her with that direct, even gaze that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at the world, unguarded and honest. It does not always work out. No, she agreed. It does not always work out. Something passed between them in that admission, the recognition of two people who have both suffered the world's tendency to fail the people it should protect, and who have not been made cynical by it but have made a complicated and ongoing peace with it. After supper, Warren left to check on the night deputy, and Clara sat down with her mending, and Inez found herself at the window watching the main street of Harlow's Creek in the dark. She was still in this town. She was still here, and the man she was afraid of was still here, and the situation that had been grinding her down for 7 months was not yet resolved. But it felt different tonight. It felt like something was in motion rather than static. It felt like she had stopped running and started moving, and while those two things looked similar from the outside, they felt entirely different from the inside. She went to bed and slept without dreaming, and in the morning she felt steadier than she had in months. The next 4 days were the strangest of Inez's life. She stayed at Clara's house, which became a kind of base of operations, and Warren came by twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, to update her on what was happening with the inquiry, and to discuss the testimony she was preparing to give. He brought her paper and a pen and asked her to write down everything she remembered, every conversation with Rourke, every threat, every instance in which she had felt coerced. She wrote for hours each day, filling page after page with her clear, precise handwriting, and he read what she wrote with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and occasionally asked a question or noted something that needed expanding, and she answered him. They were not formal conversations. They were not professional interactions exactly either. They were something in between, something she did not have a name for yet, where two people were working toward a common purpose, and in doing so were learning the texture of each other's minds. She noticed that he had a particular way of going quiet when he was working through something difficult, a kind of interior stillness that was entirely different from the stillness of a man who had nothing to say. She noticed that he made small, dry observations about the absurdity of various situations that were so understated they almost slipped past her, and then she would catch them and find herself wanting to laugh at inopportune moments. She noticed that he never spoke about women the way that most men she had encountered in the West spoke about women, as a category of problem to be managed or an asset to be possessed, but simply as people, which was more unusual than it should have been. On the 3rd day, he brought her a book. It was a battered copy of a novel she had read years ago, and he set it on Clara's kitchen table beside her coffee with no fanfare and said, "In case the writing gets tedious." Clara said you had read everything she owns. Inez picked it up and looked at it. "This is Jane Eyre," she said. "I know," he said. "I've read it." She looked up at him. He was pouring himself coffee, and he did not appear to think this was a remarkable statement. "You read Jane Eyre," she said. "A woman in Missouri lent it to me during a very long winter," he said. "I found it interesting, though I thought Rochester was intolerable for the first 100 pages." "He is intolerable for longer than that," Inez said. "Fair point," he said, and sat down across from her and drank his coffee, and they talked about the book for the better part of an hour, and it was the most pleasant hour Inez had spent in longer than she could accurately remember. She told herself this was not the beginning of something. She told herself she was a woman who had buried a husband and survived a prolonged campaign of intimidation, and was in the middle of a legal crisis, and this was not the time to notice that a man's laugh made her want to hear it again. She told herself these things with some seriousness, and then noticed that she was thinking about him when he was not in the room, which was not the behavior of someone who had successfully told themselves something. On the fourth day, everything changed. Patrick Rourke came to Clara Finn's house. Inez was at the kitchen table when she heard the knock, a hard, proprietary knock that announced itself as belonging to someone who expected doors to open for them. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression of careful neutrality that Inez recognized as controlled alarm. She shook her head slightly at Inez, who understood and moved quickly and quietly toward the back hallway. She heard Rourke's voice through the closed kitchen door, and even at a distance it made her skin tighten. Patrick Rourke was a man of 52, broad and silver-haired and impeccably dressed in the manner of someone who has made a great deal of money by transferring it from other people and wants the world to know he has it. His voice was smooth and authoritative and carried the absolute certainty of someone who had rarely been told no and had long since lost any patience for the experience. "I have been told," she heard him say to Clara, "that a certain woman has been seen in this vicinity. I am simply concerned for her welfare." "I have no idea who you are referring to," Clara said, and her voice was admirably steady. "Mrs. Barrett," Rourke said. "Inez Barrett, a widow woman in a difficult situation. I would very much like to speak with her and assure her that her situation is not as dire as she perhaps believes." "I have not seen her," Clara said. A pause. "I hope," Rourke said, and the warmth in his voice dropped about 20 degrees, "that you are not allowing sentiment to lead you into a situation that would be unpleasant for you, Clara. You are a woman of property and standing in this community. It would be a shame if that standing were to become complicated." "Good day, Mr. Rourke," Clara said. Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of boots on the porch and the door closing. Inez came back into the kitchen. Clara was standing very straight with her arms folded, and her chin elevated in a particular way that suggested she had just done something that required courage and was quietly proud of herself. "He knows I am here," Inez said. "He suspects," Clara corrected. "There is a difference, and now we know that he has connected the dots faster than Warren hoped." She looked at Inez with clear eyes. "We need to send word to Warren." Warren arrived within 20 minutes, which told Inez that he had not been far away, and she registered the implication of that with a warmth she tried to set aside in favor of the more pressing problem. "The marshal's deputy is riding from Newton as we speak," Warren said, and he had the alert, contained energy of a man who has been waiting for a situation to come to a head and is now managing the controlled explosion of it. "He should be here by tomorrow evening. We need Inez in a secure location until then." "I am in a secure location," Inez said. "You were," he said. "Now that Rourke has placed you here, this location is compromised. We need to move you." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. "The most secure option I have is my own rooms at the end of Front Street. I stay above the harness shop. It is not ideal, I understand that, and I want you to understand that I am making the suggestion purely on practical grounds, and you are entirely free to refuse it." "I accept," Inez said. He stopped turning his hat. He looked at her. "Practically speaking," she added, and he met her eyes and something shifted between them. A small, careful acknowledgement, not acted upon but not ignored either. Warren's rooms above the harness shop were two modest spaces, a sitting room and a sleeping room, with a wood stove that he had already stoked against the November cold. He gave her the sleeping room and took the couch in the sitting room without making any kind of issue of it, simply arranging the situation, and then retreating to read by the lamp, and she appreciated the ease of it more than she could quite express. She lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the building settling in the cold and to the distant, muffled sounds of Front Street below, the occasional horse, and the creak of wagon wheels, and the far-off voice of someone calling to someone else. Harlow's Creek going about its nighttime business, unaware that in a small room above the harness shop, a woman who had spent 7 months being afraid was feeling something very different from afraid. She felt, for the first time in a long time, as though she was not alone. She got up quietly in the early morning before the sky had properly decided to be light, and found Warren already up, sitting at the small table by the window with a cup of coffee and the ledger open before him. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and there was a moment of the particular morning intimacy that comes from sharing a space, from seeing each other in the unguarded hours before the day assembles its formal arrangements. "Coffee is on the stove," he said. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him and looked at the ledger. "What are you looking at?" "The last entry," he said. "What Clement wrote about the Colorado land and the railroad assessor." "I have been thinking about it." He turned the book toward her. "The land Rourke wants you to sign over, the Colorado parcel. Clement says here it is not what Rourke claims it is, meaning Rourke has been telling you the land is worth very little, worthless, essentially, as a way of pressuring you to sign it over cheaply. But Clement believed it was actually worth a great deal." Inez stared at the page. "I never questioned what Rourke said about it. He always dismissed it as a piece of scrubland in the mountains." "There are surveyors in this territory who work for the railroad," Warren said quietly, "and there are certain tracts of land that the railroad is quietly very interested in, and the people who own those tracts often do not know it until someone buys it from them for far less than its actual value and then sells it to the railroad at a significant profit." He looked at her. "I believe that is what this has been about from the beginning, not just the land itself, the access, the railroad route." The clarity of it spread through her like cold water. All of it: Clement's death, the months of pressure, the carefully constructed isolation, Thomas being managed, the legal threats. All of it had been about getting her to relinquish a piece of land that was worth enormously more than she had been told, that Clement had discovered was worth enormously more, and that Rourke had been engineering the transfer of for his own profit. Clement had known this. He had written it down. He had put the ledger in the lockbox and given Inez the key because he had known he was running out of time and she was the one he trusted. "He tried to protect me," she said softly. "Yes," Warren said. "He did." She did not cry. She felt something large and heavy shift inside her, the kind of movement that is not dramatic but is irreversible, like a door closing or a season turning. Grief and gratitude and anger and love, all present at once in the particular way they tend to be when someone you have lost is finally allowed to be fully real again in your memory. "Let us make sure it counted for something," she said. "That is exactly what we are going to do," Warren said. Marshal Aldridge's deputy, a compact man named Reeves who wore a dusty federal badge and had the exhausted competence of someone who had ridden a long way to be here, arrived the following evening on the stage from Newton. Warren brought him to the harness shop rooms, and Inez sat across from him for 2 hours and gave her testimony clearly and completely. Beginning with the first time, Patrick Rourke had come to her with his smooth suggestions about what she should do with the Colorado land deed, proceeding through every subsequent conversation, every implied threat, every instance in which Thomas Barrett had been used as a vehicle for pressure, and ending with the morning of Clement's death and everything she knew about the circumstances of it. Deputy Reeves was a careful listener. He wrote everything down and asked precise follow-up questions, and at the end said, "This, combined with the ledger, is going to be sufficient. I believe we can make an arrest within the week." After he left, Inez sat very quietly for a long moment, and then Warren said, "You did well." "I did what Clement would have wanted," she said. "I should have done it months ago." "You did not have the means to do it safely months ago," he said gently. "You were alone." "I was alone," she agreed. The word sat between them differently from how it had when she said it in her own head. In her own head, it had been a statement of condition. Said aloud in this room, with this man across from her in the lamplight, it sounded more like a thing that was in the process of ceasing to be true. The arrest of Patrick Rourke took place not within the week, but within 3 days. Marshal Aldridge himself came from Wichita, arriving on a Tuesday morning with 2 deputies and the federal warrant that had finally, after 18 months of careful assembly, enough evidence behind it to be beyond question. Rourke was taken from his house on the south side of Harlow's Creek at 8 in the morning, and if he had been warned, he gave no sign of it. emerging in his dressing gown with the expression of a man who is making a calculation about whether this is survivable and arriving at an answer he does not like. Inez watched from the window of the harness shop as they brought him down Front Street in handcuffs, and she felt the long, knotted tension in her chest finally begin to release, thread by thread, the way a rope unravels when you find the right end of it and pull. Thomas Barrett came to see her that afternoon, and she agreed to speak with him because she believed it was necessary, and because she had decided that necessary things should not be avoided simply because they were uncomfortable. He was a weaker man than his brother had been, in every sense physically softer, morally yielding, and possessed of a deep unhappiness about himself that he expressed by making other people small. He stood in Clara's parlor and looked at her with the combination of shame and resentment that characterized all his dealings with her, and she stood straight and let him look. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that I did not believe he would actually, that I did not think." "You did not think," she agreed, not unkindly but clearly. "You chose not to think, Thomas, because thinking would have made what you were doing harder. I understand that. But your brother is dead and a man is in federal custody and a great deal of harm has been done, and thinking sooner would have changed that." He had no answer to that. He left with his hat in his hands, and she heard the door close behind him, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the particular quiet that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is at last being corrected, imperfect and incomplete, but moving in the right direction. The weeks that followed were full of the practical business of resolution. The federal inquiry continued in Wichita, and Inez went there twice to give additional testimony, and Warren accompanied her both times. On the first trip, he was there in his official capacity, as the deputy who had been central to the evidence gathering, and they were professionally circumspect on the train and in the formal rooms of the inquiry. On the second trip, the formality had worn away somewhat, and when they were not giving testimony, they walked through Wichita in the cold December air and talked about everything that was not the inquiry. She told him about growing up in Ohio, in a small town where her father had taught school and her mother had kept an extraordinarily ambitious garden, and how she had come west because she had wanted something larger and more unpredictable than Ohio, which had given her exactly that. He told her about the cattle drives, 2 years on the Kishom Trail in his early 20s, the physical enormity of moving 10,000 cattle across the open country, the way it got into your sense of scale and never quite left. On the train back from Wichita, the second time, they were sitting across from each other in the rattling passenger car, and the winter darkness was thick outside the windows, and she found him watching her with an expression she had been learning to read over the past several weeks. "What are you going to do?" he asked, "after this is finished?" She had been thinking about that. The Colorado land was hers, properly and uncontestedly, and its value, which the federal inquiry had confirmed to be substantial, the railroad interest being exactly what Clement had suspected, meant that she was not the penniless widow she had believed herself to be for the past 7 months. She had options. She had more options than she had thought possible when she was standing in a dark stable in November with her hands shaking and a borrowed horse and $43. "I thought I might go to Colorado and see what I own," she said. He nodded slowly. "That is a reasonable plan." A pause. The train swayed around a long curve and the lamp above them swung gently. "What about you?" she asked. "My arrangement with Harlow's Creek is temporary," he said. "The deputy position was always intended as a specific thing. Once the inquiry concludes, my obligation there is complete." And then, he looked at her, and in the swaying lamplight she saw everything she had been seeing for weeks, everything she had been cataloging and translating and arguing herself out of interpreting too broadly. But she was tired of arguing herself out of things. She was tired of making herself smaller than she was. "Then I suppose," he said, "that depends on a number of things." "Such as?" she asked. "Such as whether you would find my company tolerable for the foreseeable future," he said, and the careful understatement of it was so characteristic of him that she felt warmth move through her in a great, unmistakable wave. "I have found your company tolerable," she said, and let the words sit between them for a moment, letting him understand exactly how much she was understating in return. His smile was slow to arrive, and when it came, it transformed his face in a way she had not fully seen before, because he was not a man who smiled easily or often, and the rarity of it made it matter more. She felt the smile the way you feel sunlight after a long period of overcast physically, in the skin. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we have something to discuss." They did not discuss it on the train, because the car was not private and neither of them was the kind of person who preferred to have important conversations in the presence of strangers. But when they arrived back in Harlow's Creek and stepped onto the cold platform, and their breath made clouds in the dark December air, he offered her his arm to walk across the icy platform, and she took it. And that was a kind of discussion in itself. Warren walked her to Clara's house because she had returned there for propriety's sake once the immediate crisis had passed, and at Clara's gate he stopped and turned toward her and said, with the same direct, honest quality he brought to everything, "I would like to court you properly, Inez. If that is something you are open to." "Court me," she said. "Yes," he said, "in the formal sense. Openly." With the clear intention of he paused, and she was delighted to discover that he was slightly, carefully nervous, that the steadiness that seemed so absolute in him had an edge that could be found, of making something serious of it, if you would allow that. She thought of the dark stable and the last horse and the shaking of her hands and the gate that he was standing in front of. She thought of him stepping aside and showing her the open gate and letting her choose, and of her choosing to come back inside. She thought of the ledger on the table in the lamplight and the book about Jane Eyre and the train and his smile. "I would allow that," she said. He nodded once formally, and then his face did something complicated and wonderful, the relief and the pleasure all mixed together, and he said, "Good night, Inez," in a voice that was slightly different from how he had said her name before, fuller, somehow more inhabited. "Good night, Warren," she said, and went inside and stood in Clara's hallway for a moment just breathing, and Clara appeared from the parlor doorway, took one look at her face, and said simply, "Well then," with a satisfaction that suggested she had seen this coming for some time and was pleased to have been right. Christmas in Harlow's Creek that year fell on a Sunday, and the town put up evergreen boughs along the front of the church and the schoolhouse, and there was a dinner at the community hall that half the town attended, and Warren Bancroft arrived at Clara Finn's house at 4 in the afternoon to escort Inez Barrett to that dinner, wearing a clean coat and a new hat, and looking, Clara observed from behind the parlor curtain, very pleased with himself. Inez wore a dress she had borrowed from Clara, a deep blue wool that fit her better than it had any right to, and when she came down the stairs and Warren saw her, he did the thing she had begun to love, which was that he went very still for a moment in the way of someone who is taking something in completely. And then he said, "You look beautiful," without any awkwardness about it, as a simple statement of observed fact. They walked to the community hall through the cold, clear evening, and she took his arm, and the town saw them together and drew its own conclusions, and Inez found that she did not mind at all the conclusions being drawn. The dinner was warm and loud, and full of the particular noise of a community gathered together against the darkness of midwinter, children running between the tables and fiddlers tuning up in the corner, and the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke and spiced cider. Warren knew more people than she would have expected for a man who had been in town only a few months, which was a testament, she thought, to the quality of his attention. He remembered names. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He was interested in people as individuals rather than as backdrop, and people responded to that. She found herself at his side throughout the evening and found it easy, natural, the kind of fit that you do not have to work at, that simply exists and you recognize it when you encounter it. They ate together and then danced together. He was not a particularly accomplished dancer, but he was game about it, and she was better than him, and she was amused by how quickly he tried to learn and improved just within the span of a single song, which was characteristic. Near the end of the evening, when the fire was lower and the children were drooping and the music had gone from lively to slow, he asked her quietly, "Are you happy tonight?" She considered the question seriously, because she was someone who considered questions seriously. She was in a town she had tried to escape, among people who knew her as a widow in a difficult situation, in a borrowed dress, with a legal matter still in process, and a future that was not yet fully shaped. She was not safe in any of the ways that the word is usually used. But she was unafraid, and she was alive in all the ways that matter, and she was next to this man who looked at her as if she was worth the full weight of his attention. "Yes," she said, "I am happy tonight." He nodded, as if this was information he was filing carefully away, and took her hand where it lay on the table, and held it with the same quiet deliberateness with which he did everything else, and she turned her hand over and held his in return. The inquiry concluded in February of 1883, and Patrick Rourke was indicted on 6 federal charges including conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and the charge that carried the most weight and the longest potential sentence, which was complicity in the death of Clement Barrett. It would be a year before the trial concluded, and the outcome was not certain, but what was certain was that Rourke was in federal custody and was likely to remain there for a very long time, and the machinery of his various manipulations had been dismantled with the thoroughness that Marshall Aldridge brought to his work. Thomas Barrett left Harlow's Creek in March, going east to relations in Indiana, and Inez watched him go without particular emotion. She had resolved what needed resolving with Thomas, which was not forgiveness exactly, but was the laying down of a weight she had been carrying, and she wished him a quiet life and meant it and was finished with him. She had been corresponding with a land agent in Colorado, and what she learned about the parcel in the mountains confirmed everything the inquiry had revealed. It was not the barren scrubland Rourke had described to her, but a substantial piece of land in a valley through which the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad would be routing its expansion within the next decade, and the value of it was such that she was, by any reasonable measure, a woman of genuine independent means. The knowledge of it was both vertiginous and clarifying, the way any large change is when you have spent a long time believing the world to be smaller than it is. She sat with Warren in Clara's parlor on a wet March evening and told him about it, the full scope of what she had learned, and he listened with his characteristic attention and at the end said, "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to see it," she said. "I have never seen it. Clement bought it sight unseen from a land office in Denver before we were married, on the advice of a friend who knew the territory. I want to go there and see the thing that all of this has been about." "Then you should go," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and the firelight moved across his face, and she could see him thinking, the interior deliberation visible in the set of his jaw. "You could come," she said. He looked at her then. "To Colorado." "Unless you have pressing obligations elsewhere," she said, and kept her voice neutral though it cost her. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what I want to do now that the inquiry work here is finished, and I have been thinking about it very specifically in terms of you." "Tell me," she said. "I would like," he said carefully, "to do this correctly. I would like to speak to you about the future properly, and I would like it to be clear that when I do, I am speaking from a considered position and not from impulse." He paused. "May I take some time to do that properly?" "How much time?" she asked. He almost smiled. "A few days." "You may take a few days," she said. She was not sure what she had expected him to do with those days, but it was not what he actually did, which was to seek out Clara Fenn and have a conversation with her that Clara refused to detail to Inez afterward except to say, with great satisfaction, that it had been a very sensible conversation, and that she had given him an honest account of her observations, which she described as favorable. He also, she learned later, wrote a letter to his mother in Missouri. On the third day he came to Clara's house in the evening and asked Inez to walk with him, and they walked through the early spring dusk of Harlow's Creek, the first warm evening of the year, the air carrying the smell of wet earth and distant grass, and they walked to the small rise at the edge of town from which you could see the prairie spreading out in all directions, enormous and various and full of possibility. "I want to marry you," he said. Not a question, she noticed immediately. A declaration. But he continued before she could respond. "I want to say that clearly and without hedging so that you know exactly what I am asking for and what I am prepared to offer. I'm not asking for anything tentative or convenient. I am asking for the whole of it, for a life made together, for going to Colorado and seeing the land that Clement left you and deciding together what to make of it and where we want to go from there." He turned to look at her, and his face in the evening light was as open as she had ever seen it. "I know that you have had a hard several years and that trust does not come easily to you, and that there is no reason you should make any decision quickly. If you need more time—" "I do not need more time," she said. He stopped. "I have had 7 months of running and 3 months of standing still and thinking clearly," she said. "I believe that is sufficient time for knowing my own mind." She looked at him in the fading evening light, this man who had been standing at the gate when she needed someone to stop her, not to keep her but to give her another choice, who had given her back the things that had been taken from her not by riding in heroically, but by doing the quiet, necessary, careful work of someone who actually respects the person they are helping. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He breathed out, and she realized he had not been as certain as he seemed. That he had hoped, had believed, but had not allowed himself to be certain, because he was someone who respected the autonomy of other people's decisions too much to presume. She loved that about him fiercely in that moment. He took her hands in both of his and held them, and looked at her with an expression that was full and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, the full force of what he felt visible without the careful management that was his habitual mode. "Good," he said simply, and it was the same word he had used on the night she agreed to let him court her, and it carried the same enormous understatement, and she found it perfect. She leaned up and kissed him then, because she was tired of waiting, and he had offered her everything she wanted, and she was finished being cautious about wanting it, and he kissed her back with a warmth that was like the first truly warm day of spring, the kind that reminds you why you endured winter. They were married in Harlow's Creek on the 14th of April, 1883, in the small church at the end of Front Street, on a day when the prairie wildflowers were just beginning to push through the dry grass, and the air smelled of something new beginning. Clara Finn stood up for Inez, and a lanky young man named Holt, who had been Warren's closest ally during the inquiry, stood up for Warren, and the minister spoke briefly and well. And when Warren said the vows, his eyes were on Inez the entire time, not with the distracted gravity of a man getting through a required ritual, but with the focused attention of someone who is fully present in the most important moment of his life so far. Inez said her vows and meant every word of them, which was different from the first time she had said vows, not a criticism of Clement, whom she had loved, but a recognition that she was older now, and the words meant different things when you said them with your eyes fully open. After the ceremony there was cake at Clara's house, and the spring light came through the windows and made everything look slightly better than usual, and Warren stood with his hand at the small of Inez's back in the easy, natural way of a man who is exactly where he wants to be, and people came and offered good wishes, and the afternoon passed in a warmth that felt like it belonged to a different life than the one she had been living, which she supposed was exactly true. They left for Colorado 3 days later, on the morning stage to Newton, and then the train to Denver. Inez brought her canvas satchel with its replenished contents, more than $43 now, considerably more, and the Colorado land deed, which she had carried so long and so carefully, and which she finally allowed herself to look at with something other than anxiety. Warren brought a moderate travel bag, and the practical competence of a man who has spent years moving through the world and knows how to do it efficiently. The train from Denver took them south into the mountains, and Inez sat at the window and watched the land change from the flat certainty of the plains to the dramatic upheaval of the Rockies, the peaks coming up around them like a sentence building to something extraordinary. And she felt the same emotion she had felt when she first came west as a young woman, the sense of the world being larger than any single life could contain, which she had always found comforting rather than daunting. Warren sat beside her and did not talk over much, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. He understood that some experiences needed to be felt fully without narration layered over them. But at one point, as the train rounded a long curve and the valley where her land was came into view below them, green and wide and threaded through with a silver line of creek, he put his hand over hers on the armrest without comment, and she turned her palm up and held it. The valley was more beautiful than she had words for. The land agent who met them in the small settlement at its northern end was a fussy, energetic man named Carruthers who drove them out to the parcel in a wagon and talked the entire time about the railroad assessments and the projected values and the legal particulars. And Inez listened carefully and asked precise questions that made Carruthers revise his impression of her considerably upward from what it had been when she arrived. The land itself was several hundred acres of valley bottom and lower slope, with the creek running through the middle of it and stands of aspen at the edges and the mountains rising behind. There was a small existing structure, a rough one-room building that had been used by a previous claimant as a trapper's shelter, and standing in it Inez could see in all directions through the gap-planked walls and feel the light coming in from everywhere. "What are you thinking?" Warren asked, standing beside her in the shafting light. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that this is worth building something on." He looked out through the open door at the valley and the creek and the mountains and said, "Yes, it is." They spent a week in the valley, camping with supplies from the settlement and talking about what might be done with the land. There were decisions to be made that were not simple: whether to sell the land to the railroad when the time came, which would yield significant money, but would also mean handing it over to corporate interests that Clement had specifically warned about in his ledger, or whether to hold it and develop it independently, which would require capital and time and the building of something from the ground up. These were large decisions, and they made them together. In the way that Inez was learning was the particular character of her partnership with this man. Nothing unilateral, everything discussed. Her opinion carried with the same weight as his, which was so different from what she had known before that it continued to surprise her even as it settled into something that felt simply true. They decided to hold the land and build something of their own on it, not to sell it. Not to let the railroad have it, at least not yet and not cheaply. To do something with the thing that Clement had left her, that had cost so much, something that would make the cost worth it. Warren, who had the practical skills of a man who had built and mended things all his life, began making sketches of what a proper structure might look like on the site where the trapper's cabin stood. He had opinions about how a house should face to catch the morning light and avoid the winter wind, and he explained these opinions to Inez, who had opinions of her own about the same matters from a different angle, and their opinions overlapped and contradicted and eventually resolved into something better than either of them had started with, which seemed to her to be how it should go. They returned to Harlow's Creek in May to settle the last of their affairs there. Warren formally resigned his deputy position, which was accepted with the kind of reluctant gratitude that Marshall Aldridge brought to the conclusion of things he had depended upon and was now losing. Clara Finn held a small supper for them on their last night, and there were people around the table who had become, in the compressed and intense span of these past months, genuinely important to Inez Clara herself and Holt, and the doctor who had been quietly helpful during the inquiry, and old Caldwell, who had been told about the borrowed roan mare and who had received his compensation with a gruff magnanimity that turned out to be characteristic of him, once you got past the gruff. At the end of the evening, when the others had gone, and it was just Inez and Warren and Clara in the cleared-up kitchen with the last of the coffee, Clara looked at them both across the table and said, with the frankness that was always her mode, "I want you to know that I am proud of you both. Not in the grandmotherly way, which I reserve for actual grandchildren and which I am still waiting on, but in the way of having watched two people conduct themselves with intelligence and decency in a situation that required both and rewarded neither." "Thank you, Clara," Warren said. "Thank you," Inez echoed, and meant it in ways that would have taken a long time to fully articulate. "Now go to Colorado," Clara said, "and do something beautiful with that valley." That was in the spring of 1883. They went. The building of the house in the Colorado Valley took the better part of that summer and the following spring, and it was not a small or rushed project. Warren hired 2 men from the settlement who were experienced builders, and he worked alongside them as a matter of pride, and because he was constitutionally unable to be idle when there was physical work to be done. Inez kept the accounts, which she was good at, and managed the supply arrangements, which she was also good at. And as the structure went up, she walked through it at every stage, imagining the life that would happen inside it. The house that emerged from that process was solid and well-proportioned, with large windows to the south to catch the winter sun, and a wide front porch that looked out over the valley and the creek. And inside, rooms that were not large but were well-made, with good floors and a proper kitchen with a range that Inez had specific requirements about, and which Warren had listened to carefully and incorporated into the plans. She planted a garden in the first summer, a kitchen garden behind the house in the shadow of the aspens, and it was smaller and less ambitious than her mother's garden in Ohio. But it was hers in the way that only the things you make from scratch can be yours, and she tended it with a satisfaction that was one of the cleaner pleasures of her life. By the autumn of 1884, they were established in the valley in the way that settlers become established. Not fully, never fully, but with enough roots down that the land had begun to feel like a place rather than a project. There was a small community growing around them. 3 other families who had come to the valley for the same combination of reasons that brought people west, the desire for space and possibility, and the chance to make something new. They were good neighbors in the way that isolation tends to produce, practical and mutually helpful without excessive intimacy. Warren had taken on work as a land surveyor, which used his knowledge of the territory and paid reasonably well, and let him spend time on horseback in the landscape he loved. On evenings when he came home with the last of the light behind him and the mountains going dark against the sky, Inez would stand on the porch and watch him ride down the valley track toward the house, and the feeling she had every time was one she had not expected to find so uncomplicated after the life she had lived: simple gladness, straightforward happiness at the sight of him. He was not a demonstrative man in the way that some people mean by demonstrative. He did not make speeches or large gestures, but he showed what he felt in constant small ways, in the way he listened when she spoke, in the care he took with the things that mattered to her, in the fact that he always told her what he was thinking rather than managing her access to it. He was, she had concluded after more than a year of marriage, the most genuinely honest person she had ever known, not honest in the rigid or judgmental way, but in the deeper sense of someone who considers deception an insult to the people around them and simply declines to practice it. She loved him with a completeness that still sometimes surprised her, that still had the quality of discovery about it even as it deepened and settled into the fabric of their days. In March of 1885, she told him she was expecting. He was sitting at the table reading a surveying report when she said it, and he put the report down and looked at her in the particular way that meant he was making sure he had heard correctly before he responded. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and came to her and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then said, quietly and with great feeling, "Good." She laughed at that, the word that had come to mean so much to her, the word that was his particular way of expressing an emotion too large for him to immediately find other words for. And he smiled at her laugh and then held her very carefully, as if she were something that could not afford to be broken, which she found touching and also slightly unnecessary, and told him so. "I'm expecting a child," she said against his shoulder. "I am not made of glass." "No," he agreed. "You are not." And held her anyway. Their son was born in October of 1885, a large and emphatic infant who arrived in the small hours of a morning when the first snow of the year was just beginning to fall, and the mountains outside the window were going white. Warren was present throughout, which was not what every man would have chosen, and which Inez had not required of him, but which he had chosen without apparent deliberation, as if the idea of being elsewhere had simply not occurred to him. When the child was finally in the world, and the midwife from the settlement had declared everything well and withdrawn to the kitchen, Warren held his son for the first time with the particular expression of someone confronting something entirely beyond their previous experience, a kind of awed disorientation, and Inez watched him and felt a love for him so fierce it was almost difficult to bear. They named him Eli James Bancroft. Eli for the sound of it, which they both liked. James for Warren's father. Clara Finn came from Harlow's Creek to see Eli in November, making the journey with the same practical competence she brought to everything. And she held the baby with the ease of someone who has held many babies, and declared him perfect and Inez well and Warren satisfactory, which from Clara was high praise. She stayed for 2 weeks and helped with the house and told Inez things about the management of an infant that proved genuinely useful and that no one else had told her, and when she left, Inez held her for a long time on the porch while Warren loaded her bags into the wagon. "You are going to be excellent at this," Clara said quietly. "You always were excellent at the things that mattered." "I am learning," Inez said. "Learning is the same thing," Clara said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Patrick Rourke went to prison in the spring of 1885, convicted on 4 of the 6 charges. The trial in Wichita had lasted longer than Marshal Aldridge had hoped, but the evidence had been sufficient in the end, and Clement Barrett's ledger had been, as Warren had predicted on that first morning, the most important piece of it. Inez read the news in a letter from Holt, who had stayed in Harlow's Creek and become the deputy marshal himself, and she felt the closure of it like a weight finally, fully lifted. She went outside afterward with the letter still in her hand, and stood on the porch in the spring afternoon and looked at the valley, the creek running high with snowmelt and the aspens budding at the edge of the land. And she thought about Clement, and about everything that had been taken and everything that had been recovered and everything that had been made from what was left. And she felt, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of completion. Warren came out of the barn and saw her there and came to stand beside her, and she handed him the letter without a word. He read it and was quiet for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It is done," she confirmed. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built and looked at the land that had cost so much and given so much back. And Eli was asleep in the house behind them, and the mountains were clear against a blue April sky, and it was, Inez thought, exactly what it should be. The years that followed were full. Not without difficulty. A hard winter in 1886 that tested the house and the livestock and their reserves in every sense. A legal dispute with a neighboring claim that required months of correspondence and 2 trips to Denver before it was resolved in their favor. And the particular ordinary trials of building a life in a remote and beautiful and demanding landscape. But full in the way that makes difficulty bearable, full of work that meant something and of days that added up to something larger than themselves. Eli grew from the emphatic infant into a small, brown-haired, serious-faced boy who had his father's way of watching the world carefully before engaging with it, and his mother's way of engaging with it thoroughly once he had decided to. He loved the horses, they kept 4 now, with an intensity that was almost comical, and that Warren indulged with the patient dedication of a man who loved horses himself, and saw no reason to moderate a reasonable passion. In the autumn of 1887, Inez told Warren she was expecting again, and they received this news with the same gladness as the first time, but with the additional equanimity of people who had done this before, and knew, within the ordinary uncertainties, what they were doing. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in the spring of 1888, smaller and quieter than Eli had been, with Inez's dark eyes and Warren's jaw, which would be more appropriate in about 15 years. They named her Clara, the second name chosen with the deliberateness of an acknowledgement, and they wrote to Clara Fenn in Harlow's Creek that same evening to tell her. Clara wrote back with characteristic brevity, "A fine name. I will come in the summer. Congratulations to you both." She came in July, older and slightly slower but no less sharp, and she held Clara with the same ease with which she had held Eli and said the same word, "Perfect." And this time Inez did not hold back the tears, letting them come without embarrassment, because some moments are worth crying at, and she had learned not to argue with them. That evening, after the children were asleep and Clara had gone to bed in the spare room with the view of the mountains, Warren and Inez sat on the porch in the warm July dark, the way they often did when the evenings were good, with coffee and the sounds of the valley around them and the stars enormous above the mountain peaks. "Do you ever think about that night in the stable?" he asked. She had thought about it often, though not always in the same way, sometimes with the lingering residue of fear, sometimes with the dark humor of how close she had come to simply riding away and never knowing any of this, and increasingly with a kind of wonder at the contingency of it, how much had turned on that single gate. "Yes," she said. "I almost didn't stop you," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I saw you leave the house," he said slowly, as if he had been carrying this for a while and was now deciding to put it down. "I was doing a late round. I saw you slip out with the bag and I thought, she has every right to leave, this is not my affair. I stood there for about 5 minutes arguing with myself about whether to follow you." "What made you follow?" He was quiet for a moment. "I had seen Rourke's man watching the Barrett house earlier in the week," he said. "I was afraid for you. I could not let you ride into the dark not knowing that." She absorbed this. He had not stopped her because he wanted to stop her. He had stopped her because he was afraid for her. The distinction mattered to her in a way she could not fully articulate, but which was connected to everything she had come to understand about this man over 5 years of marriage, the quality of his caring, which was always for her rather than about her. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you followed." "So am I," he said. He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between them, the gesture so familiar now that it was almost unconscious, and she felt the warmth of it and the weight of it and the way it said, as clearly as any words, all the things he had said before and all the things he would say again. She looked out at the valley in the starlight, the dark shapes of the mountains against the darker sky, the faint sound of the creek below the house, and Eli asleep with his boots still on in the way she had given up fighting, and Clara in her cradle with her small determined fists, and Clara in the spare room dreaming old woman's dreams, and Warren beside her with his hand over hers, and the land that had cost so much and given back so much more. "Warren," she said. I think she paused, feeling the fullness of it, the good specific weight of a life that is actually yours. "I think this is what it was supposed to become, all of it, even the hard parts." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it over in his way. Then he said, "Yes, I think so too." The stars moved slowly overhead in the great wheel of the July night, and the valley held them in its beautiful indifference. And they sat together on the porch of the house they had built and said nothing more for a long while, because nothing more needed saying, because they were together in the particular fullness of two people who have found each other in the middle of the difficult world and have made something lasting from the finding, and that was enough, and more than enough, and everything.